Being hypersensitive is easy to recognize. A heightened perception of incoming stimuli causes a quick reaction and high emotional activity. But what about hyposensitive people? Are they overlooked in our society? Today we see if people who are less sensitive and therefore often appear a bit clumsy or forgetful are misunderstood. And we take a deep look what hyposensitivity actually is, who is affected by it, and what the difference between hypo and hypersensitivity is. And I promise to you that after this episode, you will have a different view on clumsiness and forgetfulness, so definitely share your thoughts in the comments below today's episode. Welcome to today's episode. My name is Robert, and today we talk about the differences between hypo and hypersensitivity. And before I forget, you can also listen to the full episode on your favorite podcast platform, iTunes, Spotify. I put all the links to the podcasts in the description. For context, on my channel, I did a lot of content regarding high sensitivity or how to thrive if you have a heightened perception of stimuli or when you sense that your input in general is a bit too loud, when you get too many stimuli on your system. Doing that, I never questioned whether there is also a group of people who experience the exact opposite of that. Until one day, when I did my video about high sensitivity versus autism, I get some comments regarding hyposensitivity. You ask me, what about hyposensitivity? I was told by a psychologist that I am HSP, but how does that correlate with sensory seeking or hyposensitivity when it coexists with many sensory hypersensitivities? For my background, my son and I are both highly sensory seeking and dually diagnosed autistic and ADHD or ADHD. So reality for some people is that they are really sensitive in some areas and pretty hyposensitive in some other areas of their perception and processing of stimuli. But yeah, what actually is hyposensitivity and how can it coexist with something like hypersensitivity? I want to explain the terms first here. Sensory seeking and hyposensitive are used synonym as you did in the comment. Someone who is sensory seeking is called a hyposensitive person. That is exactly the opposite of a hypersensitive or a highly sensitive person. Hyposensitivity is a phenomenon which is typical in people with autism or Asperger's, and regarding to Dr. Len Aaron, you know her from her research in high sensitivity, not in people with a sensory processing sensitivity, which is a highly sensitive person. So hyposensitivity is obviously not appearing in HSPs. In Asperger's syndrome, 50% of people appear to be hyposensitive and 50% of people appear to be hypersensitive. We can also discuss this topic under the umbrella of a sensory processing disorder here. A sensory processing disorder is characterized by a high sensory threshold and active self-regulation strategies, which is also called short form SPD. And in an SPD, the sensory processing can be disrupted in two ways. On the one hand, which is the hyposensitive way, the input is too quiet and therefore the perception and processing of stimuli is less intense, or the input can be too loud, too intensely. Therefore, when you are hypersensitive, then you experience and process the input too intensely. Those two forms of processing can definitely lead to a lot of confusion in those who are affected with hyposensitivity or as well hypersensitivity. Someone who is a hyposensitive person seeks high sensory input because he or she doesn't feel it, which can become a problem because he or she is constantly looking for the next stimulus. So hyposensitivity and hypersensitivity as well definitely cause an experience which is described as dysfunctional for the person who is affected. Now, let's deep dive into how hyposensitivity actually feels like. When you're hyposensitive, you have a decreased perception of stimuli and you don't react that much to these stimuli. When the stimulus is increased, you do not really realize it that it's increased. You sense it most of the times when it's already pretty late. So you can imagine hyposensitivity versus hypersensitivity with a metaphor. And I used this in the previous episode where we discussed HSP versus autism and the topic of hyposensitivity already. Imagine you have a pot. Maybe you know this example already, that's a metaphor. You have a pot, a cooking pot, and it's filled with cold water. Now you put a frog in that cold water pot and you start to increase the water's temperature. When you are hyposensitive and you are that frog, imagine you are the frog in the pot, and the water temperature increases from cold to mild to moderate, then a bit warmer, and you just keep sitting in the water. Oh yeah, it's nice. It's getting a bit warmer. Then it's getting warmer and warmer, it's getting hot, and you are the frog that doesn't realize that the water is getting hot. Then the water is cooking and it's already too late for you to recognize that you're in danger. This is what happens to a hyposensitive person. So the person is recognizing too late that some things are happening around him or her. On the other hand, imagine you are a hypersensitive person, you are the frog in the pot again, and the water temperature is increased from cold to, let's say, mild, and you already recognize the change to warm, and as it gets warmer and warmer, you freak out already and you jump out of the pot before it even reached a hotter stage. This is what happens on the hypersensitive side. When you experience that stimulus as being a threat, for example, early on, then you panic way before there even is a big stressor or there even is a big danger. So you are hyper alert in comparison to the other person, which is hypo alert and reacts too late. You therefore react too early. Being hyposensitive, being that frog in the pot, feels like you are constantly feeling understimulated, so your whole system does not recognize stimuli when they happen to you. There's also that feeling of that there is low visual input. For example, now I'm sitting here in front of two bright lights of two bright softboxes, and when you're a hyposensitive person, you may not recognize these lights as bright as they maybe are. From the outside, this causes people to think that you are a bit sloppy, you're a bit clumsy, you may be a bit forgetful because you do not seem aware that much of things that happen around you. Also, what happens pretty often to people who are hyposensitive is that they may drop items, they just appear a bit unaware of their environment or appear a bit oblivious as well. But it's not just a negative thing to be hyposensitive. And I think that everyone who is a highly sensitive person or a hypersensitive person will agree on that, because you never feel that much overload and overwhelm from the outside, from incoming stimuli. So a positive side is definitely that you are not feeling stress for a long time. Most probably if you are mostly hyposensitive. So while the hypersensitive person reacts really fast to an incoming stressor, you are not aware of it until it becomes really bad. It can happen that stressful situations happen to you, for example, in a group setting, and the other people freak out while you are not even aware of it. And if nothing furthermore happens, then you just didn't realize that there was a stressor at all, which can be pretty pleasant because your stress level never is in the background of your head. Like, there is the general arousal in sensitive people. That is just not happening to you. Another thing which is, or can be a good thing, is that you do not feel that much pain or touch on your body. So you do not react strongly when something hurts you. When you, for example, walk through the forest and some piece of wood might hit your arm, you won't feel the pain, which is probably also pleasant in a way. Then you probably do not have that many self-confidence issues because you are just not aware that much of your body and mind, which also can be helpful, so you might be more confident. You never think that much about how you behave. As a really sensitive person might think all the time, like, how do I appear? How do I behave? How do I look like? You may not have that as a hyposensitive person. Also, a big advantage is that in stressful situations, you may remain calm and you can focus on the small details still in the environment. Also, you have the ability to focus more on the good things because you do not sense the bad things or the negative things that much. On the other hand, a huge challenge for someone who is hyposensitive probably is the bad introspection. So you do not know exactly what's going on in your body because your body is really simply not signaling what's happening inside. It can be the case that you just have a headache and you just do not know what's going on, and then you realize, well, I just have to poo, I just have to pee. Also, when you sense your needs and your emotions not that clearly, then that's also pretty difficult sometimes, because when you do not sense what you actually need, then you can feel confused as a hyposensitive person. On the other side, you have the hypersensitive or the highly sensitive person. That's also a good example because the highly sensitive person, and I talked about that with a couple of therapists, is always really close to their actual needs. That's the opposite. When you're a hypersensitive person, you may also not have a great sense for danger, as I said before, which definitely can be problematic and dangerous. And you may feel also emotions from other people less, which might make you appear a bit apathetic, or let's say not that empathetic. A concept of a boundary is also then maybe difficult to understand for you because you just do not understand what that actually is, because you do not sense for yourself that you need clear boundaries sometimes. Then there is also the auditory processing, which can be interrupted when you are a hyposensitive person, or which can be disrupted. So you can hear what other people say if you just listen and see this video now, but you don't hear it really precisely, and maybe you just do not understand the meaning directly. Then in comparison, I also want to go in a bit more into hypersensitive people. When you're a hypersensitive person, let's say you have Asperger's or autism, and you appear to be mostly hypersensitive, then you might have the ability to feel other people's emotions a bit more. Being hypersensitive feels really overstimulating, so you are often overwhelmed because you sense there are so many stimuli coming into your system. When you're in a city center, that's like horrible for you because you're flooded with information and impression. So there is a really high visual and auditory input coming into your eyes and ears. What happens from the outside when someone observes you as being hypersensitive, you may appear a bit anxious or nervous, also can appear a bit withdrawn, that you just dissociate and just cut yourself off from the rest of the world. A positive side definitely from being a hypersensitive individual is that you probably have a high degree of empathy. That's the opposite of the hyposensitive missing empathy, because you really sense what other people feel. That can be definitely an advantage. You can also spot details other people might not be aware of. You have a high sense of loyalty and moral, most probably, because you can really sense the pain of other people. So you probably are a really good-hearted person. And what I mentioned before, you might be really close to your actual intuition, and you can sense precisely what you need and what you are feeling. The thing what can happen here is, if you really sense emotions and your needs strongly, then it can happen to you that this confuses you, because there are so many needs, especially in a situation where you have many unmet needs which come up and make you feel, okay, I have to fulfill that need and that need. Now I feel sad, now I feel guilty, now I feel angry, and I do not know where these emotions come from. So it can happen that it's a huge mix of things that come up when you think about your needs and your emotions. Another challenge here is that you might overreact pretty quickly. You might react overly sensitive to your emotions and to the things that go on in your body. As I said, when there are many unmet needs, many emotions will come up, and that will make you upset. You might also have a high sense of danger. You feel often pretty alert, and you might have these unconscious feeling of tension. So you are hypervigilant in a way, constantly throughout your day. Now let's compare the concept of hyposensitivity with hypersensitivity and with highly sensitive individuals, and answer the question if they can coexist, even if they are the opposite. First of all, as far as I understood, there are just nuances between the terms, especially between high sensitivity and hypersensitivity. Hyposensitivity and hypersensitivity definitely result out of a sensory processing disorder, an SPD, and are experienced as dysfunctional by people with autism or Asperger's. A high sensitivity is a sensory processing sensitivity, on the other hand, which is a functional survival trait highly sensitive people have. A lot of people question whether highly sensitive person actually is an existing label, and we discussed that a lot in the previous episodes, or if it's just a broader form of the spectrum of autism. Neuroscience shows that at least 4 main brain areas are responsible for sensory processing, which are the frontal lobe, responsible for conscious thought, the parietal lobe, responsible for visuospatial processing, the occipital lobe, responsible for the sense of sight, and the temporal lobe, responsible for the senses of smell and sound. A sensory processing disorder, as well as a sensory processing sensitivity, so all forms, are affecting these brain areas. Or let's put it this way, all of these brain areas are affected if we talk about a sensory processing disorder or a sensory processing sensitivity. And if these brain areas are affected, this causes the problems or the challenges we talked about. In people's brains with autism, the same brain areas are affected. A sensory processing disorder like hyposensitivity often is a comorbid symptom of autism, but I also have to say that not all people with an SPD also have autism. I know, it's super confusing again with all the diagnoses and conditions here, so let's try to put it in a right order. SPS, a sensory processing sensitivity, is the broadest term of all of them. Then there are probably autism and ADHD, which are also sensitive conditions, which are part of this sensory processing sensitivity. And an SPD, a sensory processing disorder, is just a tiny part of that bigger construct within autism or ADHD. If we now remove all the labels, we can say your brain in the end is neurodivergent and processes most of the stimuli more intensely or some of the stimuli less intensely, and this is why they can coexist. So all of these 4 brain areas in your cerebral cortex are affected, and the question still is, why does that happen to some people? Like autism, it's also not 100% clear where these differences in people's brains actually come from, but it's most likely also caused by genetics and by the environment. Now, let's summarize. As always, when we talk about hyposensitivity, hypersensitivity, we are talking about concepts of psychology here. If a trait is experienced as dysfunctional on the one hand, or as really helpful and functional on the other hand, it is difficult to say whether it's one or the other. So there are fine nuances involved here. And maybe in a couple years we just have one big spectrum which is called autistic hypersensitivity or something like that. And hypo and hypersensitivity are symptoms often experienced by people with autism and or ADHD. But again, not all people who have a sensory processing disorder like hyposensitivity have to be autistic or have to have ADHD at the same time. So the symptoms can definitely coexist, and the 4 main lobes of the cerebral cortex are affected. In my opinion, it's just a neurodiversity in the brain, and somehow people affected have to accept it, that it's in their brain. It's really important not to bring yourself in really dangerous situations. I think that's clear if you are hyposensitive. And just keep an eye that there are some people around you that might be with you. Maybe you can also see your hyposensitive processing in some areas as a strength as well. Maybe it makes you more resistant and more comfortable in life. What do you think about hyposensitivity and hypersensitivity? Are hypersensitivity and high sensitivity the same thing? Yeah, share your thoughts in the comments below today's episode, and I see and speak to you in the next episode. Have a great day.